Hi, early modern philosophy students. Today I'm going to be talking about the third part of the main transcendental question regarding the possibility of metaphysical knowledge from Kant's Prolegomena to any future metaphysics. Before I plunge into that, I will look at some of the short assignments that I received for today. Talk about some of the comments and questions, issues that were raised there, and try and respond to them. And I think, I kind of like what I got among those short assignments. I feel like some of the questions raised let us sort of review, let us sort of dig a little bit deeper to help us get a better understanding of Kant's views on cause and effect, and the possibilities and grounds of scientific knowledge. So I appreciate those of you who turned in those comments. Let me just point out, for this Friday, I want you guys to read, the conclusion. It's not just the conclusion that I want you to look at. There's a section that's odd, Kant's Prolegomena to any future metaphysics. You got a chapter called Conclusion, and then it's followed by a chapter called Solution of the General Question of the Prolegomena. How is metaphysics possible? But anyway, I want you to read for next time the conclusion and the solution of the general question of the Prolegomena. I'll send you the reading assignment. I'll send you an outline this afternoon. And I'll probably have some folks doing a writing prompt for this Friday concerning the issues on metaphysics that I'll be talking about for today. Keep in mind that everybody should have received, a graded term paper. I think revised versions of the term papers are due next Monday, and there will be a kind of take-home exam that you will be getting. I'll also be sending out some Kant study questions soon. But anyway, let's dive in and look at some of the short writing assignments that were submitted. Let's see here. Maybe I'll start with something that I got from Luke Vanderschaff. Okay. And just backing up here, but maybe before I get into what Luke Vanderschaff has written here, maybe I should just remind you guys, right, that Kant argues that for Kant, one of the key concepts that's fundamental for the possibility of scientific knowledge is the concept of cause or necessary connection. Scientists want to come up with causal laws that enable us to predict how objects will behave and operate in the world that we experience. Right, gravitational laws allow us to predict how material objects will operate moving in space, as well. I don't mean outer space. But anyway, the concept of causation is fundamental to the possibility of a scientific understanding of the world, which attempts to give us causal laws. And Kant has some level of sympathy with David Hume's critique of our causal thinking. And Kant is sympathetic in the sense that, Kant would agree with Hume that just by perceiving one sort of event constantly followed by another kind of event, just perceiving constant conjunctions between events like getting pinched and feeling pain, seeing an object thrown into the air on planet Earth and it's falling to the ground, seeing this repeatedly. But just Kant agrees with Hume that just the perception of constantly conjoined events is not enough. That Kant's point is that doesn't count as a perception of a necessary connection. Perception of constantly conjoined events is not the same as perception of necessary connection. And yet Kant makes the point that we do assume that there are causal connections at work in the world, right? And Kant would want to say that when we do perceive this constant conjunction of events, we go on to make judgments of experience that involve the application of causation, right? After I have seen repeatedly water boiling at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, I make the judgment of experience that subjecting water to that temperature causes it to boil. And when I say that, I'm suggesting that there's a necessary connection between the heating of the water to 212 degrees Fahrenheit and its then boiling. And when I make that assertion, there's sort of a universality and an objectivity to the claim, right? When I say subjecting water to 212 degrees Fahrenheit causes it to boil, I'm suggesting there's a necessary connection. The suggestion is that therefore anyone else who has the experience of water subjected to that temperature, they too will see it boil. And there's sort of an objectivity to the claim there with the assertion of there being a necessary connection, and we can empirically test such objective claims, right? And this is part of the hallmark of science. But Kant, right? But Kant thinks what's important here is we don't get that notion of cause or necessary connection from perception. We don't ever perceive necessary or causal connections in the world. All we perceive are the constant conjunctions of events. But Kant thinks we nonetheless make the causal claims, and so this leads Kant to say it must be that we've got an innate concept of cause as a part of our faculty of human understanding, and we apply that innate concept of cause to make the objective and universal claim of there being a necessary connection between what we perceive in the world, such as water heated to 212 degrees Fahrenheit, it will boil, just for instance. But Van der Schaaf, he pushes back against Kant here. Van der Schaaf ends up arguing that, hey, maybe we do, or maybe we can derive the concept of cause from perceptual data. Van der Schaaf writes, Kant argues that there is no understanding of a causal connection between events that we experience. But his argument does not hold when applied to operations of the human mind and how we can get the idea of causation from this. Van der Schaaf continues, as Locke postulates, our idea of cause comes from the reflection on the operations of our mind, such as willing to go to the door and our body reacting in that manner. We will to go to the door, and then our body goes to the door. This reveals an obvious causal connection between the mind willing something and the action in the body occurring. Therefore, we may not be able to get the idea of causation from the sun shining on the stone. That's a famous example from Kant. But I think it is quite obvious that Locke's point handles this argument well. We observe that our mind wills the body to move. We may not understand the exact mechanism that exists to allow such motion to occur. However, nevertheless, it is clear that we can learn the cause and effect relationship if we reflect on the operations of the mind. So I take what Van der Schaaf to be arguing is that Locke actually, Van der Schaaf seems to be favoring Locke over Kant, right? Locke, in the essay concerning human understanding, Locke argued that we derive the idea of causal power from reflecting on how we can move our body in accordance with our will. So, for instance, I derive the notion of causal power from recognizing that when I will the movement of my hand to go up, it goes up. And this happens repeatedly. And I get the idea of causal power in this way, or at least of active causal power, says Locke. Um, but I would remind you, Luke, that David Hume considers this Lockean view in section 7 uh, of his inquiry concerning human understanding. And David Hume subjects Locke's view to criticism, and I think that Immanuel Kant would be sympathetic with Hume's criticism here. I wrote down here, Vanderschaft, recall that Kant is sympathetic with David Hume's argument that we don't get the idea of causal or necessary connections from perceptions of constantly conjoined events. Therefore, Kant will appeal to Hume's critique of the Lockean argument regarding willing the movement of the body, such as willing the movement of the hand and the hand going up. Kant will appeal to Hume's critique of the Lockean argument. I think Kant will say, look, we just perceive constant conjunctions of the willing of certain bodily movements followed by the movement of the body. But there's no perception of the necessity in the connection. For all I know, the next time I will the going to the door, or I will the raising of my hand, for all I know, the next time I do it, my body won't go to the door or my hand won't rise, right? I mean, what leads me to think that there's a necessary connection between my willing of the movement of my hand and the hands going up is that I've experienced repeatedly in the past the will to raise my hand, oh, hand goes up. I will to raise my hand, whoop, the hand goes up. That's what leads us to say that there's a necessary connection between the willing and the willing of the hand's movement and the movement of the hand. But when examined closely, there's just the perception of a constant conjunction between the willing and the movement of the hand. There's no perception of a necessary connection, leaving open the possibility that tomorrow or right now I will will the movement of my hand and it'll just sit there, right? And so, I think Kant's going to insist that, it's not from perceptual data that we get the idea of necessary connection, but Kant is well aware we nonetheless have the idea of necessary connection, and we apply that idea of necessary connection or cause, we apply it to what our perceptual data to form judgments of causation and necessary connection. So the idea of cause must be part of the innate apparatus of the understanding human mind. And there are others of these innate concepts of the understanding, such as the concept of substance, says Kant. But anyway, I think that's what Kant's going to say in reaction to this, Luke. Let's look at another one. I have something else here. I thought this was interesting from who is this? I think it's Selfridge, from Lindsay Selfridge. Selfridge, your questions that you raise, I think they just, I really took the opportunity. I felt like your questions just opened the opportunity for me to say more about noumenal objects and phenomenal objects. I want to use your questions that you end with to say a bit more, and maybe this would be helpful to students. Lindsay Selfridge writes, after the discussion of innate concepts of cause being empirically testable claims, or allowing for empirically testable claims, Kant moves on to noumenal objects. Kant argues that noumenal objects cannot be empirically tested in the same way due to their existence external to the mind. In part 1 of the Prolegomena, Kant recognized the existence of noumenal objects, but he argued that we cannot know anything else about them. Selfridge continues by saying, however, I wonder if these noumenal objects are outside of our possible... she writes, however, I wonder if these noumenal objects are outside of our possible perceptions. Can they even be explained further than the knowledge we have of their existence? Can we even rely on anything other than our perceptions to tell us about experiences of objects? Where does Kant stand on these questions? Lindsay, I will say, I, I'm a little bit puzzled as to precisely what your issue is or what your questions amount to, but I do think your questions invite me to say more about noumenal objects, and that's what I intend to do here. I want to just say here, Lindsay, look, noumenal objects, as Kant understands noumenal objects, they are indeed outside of our possible experience. Kant believes we cannot know anything about noumenal objects except that they must exist as the stimulus for our perceptions. For example, I perceive my computer now as I'm talking to you. This perception of the computer is passively received. So there must be a noumenal object, say the computer itself, which gives rise to the perception of the computer. But the computer, as I experience it, exists as an object of awareness internal to my consciousness. What the computer in itself, as noumena, is like, remains unknown to me. And this is the way it has to be, because there is no way for me or for anyone to step outside of my experience, or for anyone else to step outside of their experience of the world to get some privileged access to reality as it is external to their experience of it. I cannot step outside of my own experience of the world to get some privileged access to reality. I'm always, so to speak, trapped within my own experience. Now, these considerations might lead to think that Kant is some sort of skeptic. Oh, we can't know things. But Kant is not a skeptic. And Lindsay, I'm not saying that you read Kant as a skeptic, but I'm just reflecting that somebody might feel like Kant is a skeptic, but Kant is not a skeptic. And Kant is not a skeptic because he thinks that scientists and mathematicians, they know all kinds of things. But they know all kinds of things because the world as we know it is the world as experienced. The natural laws revealed by scientists, revealed by physicists and chemists and biologists, the natural laws that are revealed by scientists, they have objective validity and they are empirically testable. But that is only because those laws involve the application to objects of experience, right? Right? Those laws have application to objects of our experience, right? That is, they apply to phenomenal objects. If science was about things in themselves, things outside of any possible experience, noumenal objects, then it would not have objective validity and it would not be empirically testable. But because we have, right, and that's because we have no access to things in themselves. But science is about objects as we experience them, and we have access to the objects as we experience them, right? And we can make claims about how, right, because we've got a priori concepts of the understanding, such as that of cause, we can make claims about the objects of our experience that are testable, right? We can make claims, we can make these causal claims which suggest how anybody must experience reality, and we can check to see, is that true that anyone must experience reality that way? And this gives some sort of objective validity to the claims of science that allow for its standing as knowledge. So that's what I would want to say about this. Let's go to one more of these short assignments that I received. This comes from Molly Walker. Molly Walker focuses on some particular aspects of the example that Kant uses regarding the sun shining on the stone, or perception of the sun shining on the stone, and are then making the causal judgment that the sun warms the stone. Molly writes, she says, Kant believes that the concept of causal connection is innate to our minds, and that these judgments we make based on our experience are really just rules as to how one should continue to experience the event in the future. Molly says, to me, it seems as if he is pushing the idea of a causal predeterminacy that the sun will always be the source of the stone feeling warm. And then Molly writes, but what if a cloud appears and covers the sun? However, the stone still feels warm. Or what if there was just a fire on the stone, which is the cause of its feeling of warmth? My question then is, are these still valid conditions to suppose that the stone is still being warmed by the sun? Does Kant believe that the conditions for the stone being warm are constant, meaning that whenever the stone is warm, it is caused by the sun, regardless if the sun is present? Would Kant have a response? Yeah, I think Kant would have a response, and I'll say some things here that I think Kant might want to say. Right? I just want to, let me just say, Molly, that Kant's point is not that the sun warms the stone even on very cloudy days where the sun is covered up by the clouds. The point is that whenever the proper conditions hold, such as a warm day with clear skies and the sun shines on the stone, then the sun causes the stone to grow warm. Right? We make this kind of judgment that the sun causes the stone to grow warm. And when we make it, the presumption is that anyone who experiences the stone and the sun shining on the stone in the proper conditions will also experience the warming of the stone. And that is an empirically testable claim. Whereas if, by contrast, if I just assert that I saw the sun shining and I felt the stone warm, and if I'm not making a scientific claim, and if I never claim a necessary connection between those two experiences, then I'm just describing my own personal perceptions and making no claim about how things must be, or how others will experience the same things under the same conditions. It is only by applying the innate concept of cause to my perceptual data that an objective claim can be made about how everyone would experience things in a similar manner. This is fundamental to science, right? So notice, I'm just, in a way, I'm just sort of reviewing points here in a certain sense, but, but one of the things that I'm trying to stress here is that, according to Kant, if I just make this perceptual judgment, oh, the sun is shining, oh, the stone is warm, if that's all I'm asserting, I'm not claiming anything about how anyone else will have to experience those two events of the sun shining and the stone feeling warm, right? But when I say the sun causes the stone to grow warm, right, and I apply that innate concept of cause to those two pieces of perceptual data, sun shining, stone warm, now I'm saying something that's scientifically testable, because when I say, oh, the sun causes the stone to grow warm, I'm claiming that there's a necessary connection between those two, such that anybody who experiences the sun shining and the stone feeling and the stone under the right conditions, they will see, oh, the stone's warm, the stone is warm, and they will have to experience the stone being warm if they see the sun shining on it in the proper conditions where it's a warm day and the sky is clear. And this sort of thing, that's just the example we're working with. It's a Kantian example. I could be saying similar things about the boiling of water as well. It's very important, for instance, that you be at 1 atmospheric pressure when you subject the water to 212 degrees Fahrenheit. If you're at under other conditions of pressure, the temperature might have to be different to get it to boil. But that's what I want to say about this. Hopefully this has been somewhat useful. Hopefully this has given some additional clarification to some of you for Kant's views on causation and what makes scientific claims possible, etc. let's move on to stuff that you should have looked at for today. And there's a good bit that I want to say about this, and I might run a little bit longer than usual today to try and cover all the issues. So regarding the third part of the main transcendental question from the Prolegomena and how metaphysics is possible, I would just point out that early on in part 3 of the Prolegomena, dealing with issues of metaphysics, Kant notes that there is a distinction between the faculty of understanding and the faculty of reason. These are two different faculties of the human mind. The faculty of understanding employs a priori concepts like those of cause and substance to make judgments of experience, which are empirically verifiable. The latter, the faculty of reason, employs ideas, pure concepts of reason, to make judgments which can neither be confirmed nor disconfirmed by experience. Kant says that the human understanding is naturally driven towards a complete understanding of experience. As such, it is driven to the construction of ideas of pure reason, which lead to judgments that are empirically unverifiable. And I will be talking more about this, and we'll see more about this as we move into the section on cosmological ideas and Kant's discussion of the antinomies of pure reason. And the natural human drive to engage in metaphysical speculation. This will also be addressed and discussed further on Friday when we talk about the conclusion and the solution to the general question of the Prolegomena. I want to turn now to some things that Kant says about the psychological ideas. Right? Chief among the ideas of pure reason is the idea of a substantial permanent self, which underlies and continues to exist through the flux of changing perception which occurs in our everyday lives, right? When I think about my perceptions, right, my perceptions are in constant flux and change. Right now I see my cell phone, now I see my computer, now I see my cup of coffee, I feel the cup of coffee in my hand, I have a sip of coffee. I see the trees outside. I'm feeling cold, right? Anyway, there seems to be this ever-changing nature to our perceptions. They come and they go. They pass on. I move from one perception to another. I move from one emotion to another. I would just point out, David Hume talks about this flux-like and ever-changing nature of perception in his treatise of human nature. And we didn't read anything from the treatise. Had we not lost a week due to COVID-19, I would have had you guys read Hume's work on personal identity, because it's really quite fascinating. And Kant's thoughts on Kant, when he's discussing the psychological ideas and when he talks about the notion of a permanent self, Kant's views on the permanence of the self are largely developed in opposition to and engagement with Hume's views. But in the Treatise of Human Nature, Hume says that there is no rational basis for the belief in a permanent, enduring self that underlies the changing flux of perceptions. David Hume's got what we call a bundle theory of the self. For Hume, the self is just a collection of ever-evolving and changing ideas that seem to come and go. Hume writes eloquently on this. And sometimes when I read Hume, there's something haunting about it. Hume talks about the self as the self being like a stage where actions and events proceed, but it's a stage without a stage. There's just the actions of the actors, there's just the events transpiring, but no container there for the passing flow of perceptions. While Kant does not speak of Hume clearly on this matter in the Prolegomena, he believes that Hume is mistaken about this. Kant rejects the bundle theory of persons. Persons are not just ever-changing bundle of perceptions. Kant thinks that there is and must be a certain sort of permanence to the self over time that underlies the changing flow of perceptions. I had in my outline, I tried to capture the Kantian reasoning here, and to some extent, if I remember correctly, I think my outline here is based to some extent on Garrett Thompson's understanding of Kant on these matters. So I'm informed by Thompson's scholarship on this. But look, it seems to me Kant's reasoning goes something like this, and I'm going to want to give an example to highlight what's going on here. But look, Kant wants to say first, we perceive things in space and time, right? Our perceptions have a spatial and temporal dimension that our mind brings to the data of perception, right, through the a priori forms of intuition that are space and time. Second, we experience things as causally related, right? I believe that there's a necessary connection between the releasing of the pen and its falling. I believe there's a necessary connection between the water being subjected to 212 degrees Fahrenheit and then it's burning. I don't just look at those as disjointed, unconnected events. I don't look at the world that way, and neither do any of you, right? We look at the world as though there are connections, necessary connections between events. So look, we perceive things in space and time. We experience things as causally or necessarily connected to one another. Point 3, such perceptions and experiences, they require the application of innate and a priori forms of intuition, as well as innate and a priori concepts of the understanding, right? Such perceptions and experience require the application of those concepts and forms of intuition to the raw data of perception, right? So for Kant, there must be a unified self in which these a priori forms of intuition and these a priori concepts of the understanding inhere. I must have an enduring self that stores, that's the source of the forms of intuition, space and time, that's the source of a priori concepts of understanding like cause and substance, etc. And if there wasn't a permanence of self, we wouldn't make these judgments that say there are necessary connections between events in the world. We couldn't make those judgments of necessary connections without an enduring self that applies these concepts of cause and substance, or that applies the forms of intuition of space and time to our perceptual data. To get at this a little bit more, I tried to write out here an example that I think might be helpful. Imagine my perception of a series of events. Imagine my perception of a series of events that occur over a short time span. Okay? I see Zach Morris throwing a rock. That's one perception. I see Zach Morris throwing a rock, one perception. I see the rock flying through the air. There's another perception. A third perception. I see the rock hit the window. A fourth perception. I see the window break. Okay? So there's 4 perceptions. I see Morris throw the rock. I see the rock flying. I see rock strike window. I see window break. 4 perceptions occurring in time. When I see this, and my mind works in ways similar to yours, when I see this, I say, or I make the judgment, the throwing of the rock broke the window. Notice that's a causal claim. Were there no permanent, enduring self present, observing these 4 events, throwing, rock flying, rock striking, window breaking, were there no permanent, enduring self observing these four different pieces of perceptual data, then I would not be able to link those perceptions together using my concept of cause, my innate concept of cause, to make the causal judgment that throwing the rock broke the window, right? I have four distinct perceptual data, right? Morris throws rock, I see rock flying, I see rock strike window, I see window break, right? If I don't exist as an enduring self, taking in that perceptual data, right? And if I don't endure as a being with a concept of cause to then make judgment, the throwing of the rock broke the window, right? If there's not a permanence and unity to the self, I cannot make that judgment. You see, rather there would just be the flow of the perception. And so I do think this is at some level at the heart of Kant's belief that there has to be a permanent, enduring self that goes beyond just the flux of perception in order to make sense of our forming these judgments, like causal judgments that we make. Just for instance, I mean, I could work with another example using, and I have done in the past, worked with other examples, like using a concept of substance to make a similar point about the unity of the self. Right? So, anyway, that's Kant on issues of the substantial or permanent self. I want to turn now to something that Kant also talks about called the cosmological ideas. And here we'll see Kant appealing to the phenomena-noumena distinction to try and provide a solution to some long-standing metaphysical debates and issues. Again, Kant's got this belief that the human understanding in its quest for knowledge of all things is often led to consider certain sorts of questions concerning the nature of the world as a whole. These questions are: 1, does the world have a beginning in time, or does it extend infinitely into the past? Right? 2, is there in the world the second question, is everything in the world a composite entity, or are there some simple non-composite entities? Famously, Gottfried Leibniz argued that there have to be simple, indivisible entities. 3rd, is there any freedom in the world, or is everything causally determined? 4, is everything in the world contingent, or is there a necessary being? A lot of people conceive of God as a necessarily existing being. This is at the heart of the ontological argument for God's existence. Right? These sorts of questions, says Kant, they arise for us naturally. Right? It's natural for the human mind to wonder about these sorts of things. Is there a beginning of the world in time, or does the universe extend infinitely into the past? Is there freedom, or is everything we do subject to causal determination? Is there some sort of necessary being in the world, or is everything that exists in the world contingent, right? These are natural questions that arise for us, but these questions give rise to what Kant calls cosmological ideas, which lead pure reason into antinomies or into contradictions, right? These 4 questions, they lead into seemingly unresolvable conflicts of reason. Kant says this occurs when people mistakenly think of the world as though it was a thing in itself, standing outside of any possible experience. If we think of the world in this way, then with respect to each of these questions, either side will appear equally defensible. If we think of the world as a thing in itself standing outside of any possible experience, then we're not going to be able to verify our claims about that world. And so, sort of anything goes. in the debates on these sorts of issues. And right, and so according to Kant, it's when we think of the world as some sort of thing in itself that stands outside of any possible experience, that's what leads into these irresolvable conflicts and these irresolvable debates in metaphysics. Kant says that the key to resolving these conflicts that give rise to these antinomies of pure reason, these unending debates on those four questions I mentioned, right? If we want to resolve these conflicts, it's important to recognize that the world exists as both a phenomenal object as we experience, and it also exists as a noumenal object or thing in itself. And once we understand that the world exists as both thing in itself, noumenon outside of experience, as well as exists as phenomenal object internal to experience, once we recognize this, we will actually be able to solve, says Kant, some of these long-standing debates regarding those four questions. Kant maintains that regarding those four questions, he maintains that regarding the first two of those questions, it's actually the case, says Kant, that both the thesis and the antithesis concerning question 1 and question 2 are false. Question 1 says, does the world have a beginning and time, or is it infinite? Kant says that when you consider that the world is at once phenomenal and noumenal, it will be false that it's got a beginning, and it will be false that it is infinite. Regarding the second question, is everything in the world composite, or are there some simple substances that are non-composite? Again, Kant says once you understand that the world is at the same time both noumenal, thing in itself, and phenomenal, object of experience, you'll find that the answer to, right, you'll find that it's false that the world is composite, and it's false that there are simples, right? Regarding questions 3 and 4, once you understand the world as being both phenomenal and noumenal, you'll find that both the thesis and antithesis regarding those issues, 3 and 4, are both true. So for instance, regarding the question, is there freedom in the world? Do human beings have freedom of the will? Or is everything that we do causally determined? Kant will make the point that, well, it turns out that since human beings are both phenomenal and noumenal, we both have free will and we're causally determined in what we do, right? Or is everything in the world contingent, or is there a necessary being? Well, again, Kant's going to say that if you understand the world as both phenomenal and noumenal, it's going to turn out to be both true that everything's contingent, and also true that there is a necessary being. So what I want to do here is I don't have time to explore all of these antinomies. I thought what I would do is just explore two of them and sort of explain Kant's thinking on some of this a little bit further. So let's take a look at the first antinomy. The first antinomy regards the question of, does the world have a beginning in time, or is the world infinite, enduring infinitely into the past? Right? The thesis might be understood as the world has a beginning in time. The antithesis might be thought to be the world has no beginning in time, right? Well, what Kant does, Kant makes some interesting moves here. Kant says, look, the concepts of finite and infinite, he says they only have application to objects of possible experience, right? He goes on, he makes the point that, look, as a phenomenal object, we can have no experience of the world as a whole. So considered as a phenomenal object, the world is neither finite nor infinite. Right? As a phenomenal object, right, we can have no experience of the world as a whole. Somebody might say, well, why is that? I think the idea here is that, look, the world as a whole, when we think about the world as phenomenal object, well, then the world as a whole, it's still under construction in our experience of the world. The world is still being sort of built and constructed as phenomenal object. We're still discovering new things about the world. Our experience of the world is still unfolding. So as a phenomenal object, the world as a whole is not something that we can experience as a whole, because our experience of the world is still being revealed to us. So we cannot have an experience of the world as a whole, right? And so considered as a phenomenal object, Kant wants to say the world is neither finite nor infinite, because we can't have an experience of the world as a whole. Now, considered as a thing in itself, the world stands outside of any possible experience. And as such, the concepts of the finite and the infinite have no application to the world understood as a thing in itself, because the finite and the infinite, these are things that only have application to things that are possible experiences. In the world as noumena, outside of experience, finite and infinite have no application. And so for these reasons, Kant wants to argue that when we recognize that the world is both phenomenal and noumenal, and we recognize that, right, we can have no experience of the world as a whole, right? Well, finite and infinite will have no application to the world as a whole. And then world as thing in itself is outside of any possible experience. Finite and infinite will have no application there. And so it's false that the world is infinite. It's false that the world is finite, according to Kant. Both theses, right? And this is how he wants to sort of resolve this long-standing debate about whether the world has a beginning in time. To talk about the world as having a beginning really makes no sense. To talk about its never having a beginning makes no sense, because those concepts of the finite and infinite, they only apply to objects of possible experience, and we cannot have an experience of the world as a whole, because that world is still under construction in our experience. And finite and infinite, since they only apply to objects of possible experience, they cannot apply to a world understood as thing in itself. Let's turn to the third antinomy. Right, and here Kant's going to end up arguing that we are at the same time both free and determined in our behavior. And Kant's got a peculiar way of coming at this based on the notion of phenomena and noumena and how that applies to the self. Look, the concept of cause, or causal determination or necessary connection, this has application, again, only to objects of experience. Right? The concept of cause is intended to apply just to objects of possible experience. That's what it exists for. That's what it has application to, the concept of causal determination. Now, persons, human beings, exist as both, right? Human beings exist as both phenomenal and noumenal objects, right? I exist as an object that can be experienced, observed, and understood experientially, but at the same time, insofar as I can be observed and experienced, perceived, I must exist as noumenon to stimulate the experience of lamos, whether my experience of myself or that of others. Right? You poor bastards are subjected to the lamos experience all too often, I suppose. Right? But persons exist as both phenomenal and noumenal. And again, as Kant says, causation, that concept and causal determination has application only to objects of experience. As phenomenal objects, as observed and perceived beings, right? As phenomenal objects, human behavior, it is subject to causal determination. We can apply causal thinking to and employ causal concepts in understanding human behavior. Right? This is what empirical psychology is largely about. Understanding the causal basis of human behavior. Right? And so, understood as phenomenal objects that can be observed, right? Our behavior can be understood in terms of causal determination, right? Why is Lemos giving this lecture today? Because he desires to keep his job. He has the job of, and he believes he has the job of teacher, and he, therefore, perhaps I'm led to, determined to give the lecture today because I believe that it's important to keep my job, and I believe that I am a teacher. I believe it's time for class. I believe but all of these beliefs I have might be understood as the causal determining factors of my giving and engaging in the behavior of lecturing. So as phenomenal objects, we are subject to causal determination, but Kant goes on and says, but again, we exist not just as phenomenal observable beings, but we also exist as noumenal beings that are right, that stand outside of perceptual awareness. But notice, right, as a noumenal object, as a thing existing outside of any possible experience, we are not bound by causal determination. Causal determination has no application to phenomenal objects. Causal determination, the concept of causal determination, only has application to objects of possible experience. So as a phenomenal object, my behavior might be causally determined, but as noumenal being, standing outside of any possible observation, causation has no application. So as noumenal, I am free. And so Kant wants to say that it's true that I act free from causal determination as noumenal being. At the same time, as phenomenal object, as understood, say, by a psychologist, my behavior is subject to causal determination. So I can be both free in my behavior as noumenal subject, where causation has no application, and I can at the same time be causally determined as phenomenal being. And I can be, maybe my behavior can be understood psychologically in causal terms. And so both thesis and antithesis turn out true regarding the free will and determination debate. I'm going to make some final general marks here. Look, I'm not trying to cover, it would just be too much, everything that's going on here in this third part of the main transcendental question. Let me just conclude with some general marks. Right? In this part of the Prolegomena, Kant shows how vital the recognition of the phenomenal and noumenal worlds is in resolving some metaphysical problems. The earlier examinations of the possibility of math and geometry and natural scientific knowledge, they were crucial to this endeavor, because an examination of their possibility revealed that there must be a distinction between these realms of the phenomenal and noumenal, right? We're introduced to the phenomenal and noumenal realms in understanding what makes mathematics and geometry and natural scientific knowledge possible. All right, and then once we see that, that there are these phenomenal and noumenal realms, or at least according to Kant there are, we can then appeal to those phenomenal and noumenal realms to help us solve some according to Kant, we can appeal to those to help us solve some long-standing debates that have existed in the realm of metaphysics, say, for instance, regarding the beginnings of the world, or whether we have free will, or whether there are any simples, or is everything a compound, etc. So anyway, I hope this has been somewhat helpful. I know that Kant is rather difficult. I hope I'm not butchering him too much, but I'm trying to make him somewhat understandable for you. We'll do a little more this Friday. I'll see you guys. Bye-bye.